In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great swept through Persia, toppling the mighty Achaemenid Empire and setting off a wave of dramatic change across the region. His armies pressed eastward into the rugged lands of Bactria and Anatolia, in what is now Afghanistan, where they encountered fierce and determined resistance from local tribes. According to Greek historical sources, Alexander's campaign in Bactria and Sogdiana was especially difficult, since the guerrilla-style warfare he faced there was completely different from the large, set-piece battles he had fought earlier at Issus and Gaugamela. His main target in the region was Bessus, a nobleman who had proclaimed himself the last Achaemenid emperor under the name Artaxerxes V. Bessus had turned against the legitimate Achaemenid king, Darius III, leaving him to die rather than face capture. But as Alexander's forces advanced, Bessus's own Sogdian allies turned on him in turn, and he was seized and handed over to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals and the future founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Bessus was publicly humiliated and put to death as a usurper and traitor. Yet even in the midst of conquest, Alexander pursued a deliberate policy of cultural blending. He married the Bactrian princess Roxana, daughter of the regional nobleman Oxyartes, forging a personal link between his Macedonian court and the local aristocracy. As part of a broader strategy of integration, Alexander arranged for large numbers of local young men to be trained in Macedonian military methods, a group later associated with the Sold Epigoni, traditionally said to number around 30,000. New Greek-style cities, many bearing his own name, sprang up from Asia Minor all the way to the Hindu Kush, quietly planting the seeds of Hellenistic culture on Iranian soil. The destruction of Persepolis marked a symbolic end to the old Achaemenid order and opened the way for new Greco-Macedonian administrations that would, over time, coexist uneasily with long-established Iranian institutions. But Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE left no clear plan for succession, and his vast empire quickly fractured among his leading generals. One of these successors, Seleucus, later known as Seleucus I Nicator, took control of Iran and Central Asia by around 312 BCE, establishing what would become the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus consolidated Hellenistic rule across a huge stretch of territory from Mesopotamia to the Indus, governing eastern Iran from ancient centers such as Babylon, while also founding new cities, most notably Seleucia on the Tigris. In these early decades, after Alexander's death, Greek and Macedonian veterans settled in colonies scattered across this enormous realm, gradually mixing with local populations. Hellenistic influence, visible in art, coinage, the spread of the Greek language, and formal city planning, took firm root in the growing urban centers, while the surrounding countryside largely retained its traditional Iranian character. Seleucid rulers, following Alexander's example, encouraged intermarriage between Greeks and locals, and paid respect to both Greek gods and native Iranian deities. Even so, they had to grapple with the practical challenge of governing an extremely diverse and often unruly territory. In eastern Iran, powerful noble families and nomadic tribes beyond the Oxus River remained largely self-governing. They were not alone in resisting central control. In the northwest, the kingdom of Atropatene emerged as a stable and enduring Iranian state, founded by a local leader named Atropates in the years following Alexander's conquests. In the southwest, regional rulers known as the Frateraka, and later the so-called kings of Persis, retained a great deal of independence, minted their own distinctive coins, and preserved symbols of Achaemenid legitimacy and religious tradition, even while remaining loyal to the Seleucid crown. In the early 3rd century BCE, the Seleucids found themselves facing a powerful and ambitious neighbor to the southeast, the Mauryan Empire of India. Seleucus contested territory in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan with the Mauryan Emperor Chandragupta Maurya around 305 BCE. The conflict ultimately ended not in outright victory for either side, but in a lasting diplomatic settlement. Seleucus ceded some of his easternmost territories to Chandragupta in exchange for a substantial gift of 500 war elephants, a trade that reflected each side's military priorities. This agreement effectively fixed the border between the Indian and Iranian worlds, and over the following century, Indian culture and the Buddhist faith gradually into the region under Mauryan patronage. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka later had bilingual edicts inscribed near Kandahar, written in both Greek and Aramaic, reflecting the multicultural character of the frontier. Trade across Afghanistan flourished as the Mauryans developed the early routes that would eventually become the Grand Trunk Road, linking the Gandhara region to the heartland of India. Meanwhile, Seleucid authority in the north remained firmly in place. Greek administrators governed Bactria, and new Hellenistic cities, including one known to archaeologists as Ai-Khanum, were established along the Oxus River frontier. Excavations at such sites have uncovered the remains of a Greek theater, a gymnasium, and philosophical inscriptions, including a set of Delphic maxims carved in Greek. These discoveries show Greek settlers transplanting elements of their civic culture into distant Bactria, even as they simultaneously absorbed local artistic styles and motifs. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, however, Seleucid authority began to weaken at the far edges of the empire. Distant provincial governors, emboldened by local military strength and taking advantage of weaker Seleucid rulers, began to sense an opportunity to break away entirely. Around 250 BCE, two separate breakaway movements emerged at nearly the same time. First, Diodotus I, the Greek governor of Bactria, rebelled against Seleucid rule and declared himself an independent king, founding the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Contemporary writers described Bactria as an unusually prosperous land, home to 1,000 cities, and strategically positioned at the crossroads of trade routes leading toward both India and China. Diodotus's rebellion likely drew support from local Iranian nobles in Bactria who saw a chance to free themselves from distant Seleucid oversight. The second breakaway movement occurred just to the west. A tribal leader named Arses, at the head of the nomadic Parni people, invaded the province of Parthia in northeast-eastern Iran and overthrew the Seleucid governor there, a man named Andragoras. This was a fundamentally different kind of uprising than the one in Bactria, driven not by a disaffected Greek official, but by a nomadic conquest that expelled Hellenistic rule outright. Later Parthian chronicles claimed that Arsaces was descended from the Achaemenid royal line, a claim likely invented to lend legitimacy to the new dynasty. These two regional revolts, in Bactria and in Parthia, gave rise to two new powers that would go on to reshape the history of Iran and Afghanistan for centuries: the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the east and the Arsacid Parthian Empire in the west. Freed from Seleucid oversight, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom entered a period of real expansion and prosperity. Euthydemus, who overthrew the line of Diodotus, fortified Bactria against nomadic threats and successfully resisted a determined Seleucid attempt at reconquest. When Antiochus III, known as Antiochus the Great, marched east with a large army in 208 BCE, Euthydemus fought him to a standstill outside the walls of Bactria. After a siege lasting roughly 2 years, Antiochus agreed to a peace settlement, formally recognizing Euthydemus as king in exchange for only a token gesture of allegiance. In practical terms, this campaign achieved little for the Seleucids, who effectively granted both Parthia and Bactria de facto independence in order to secure their vulnerable eastern frontier. With Seleucid power in Iran continuing to decline, especially after their defeat by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, These newer Eastern dynasties were well positioned to fill the resulting power vacuum. In Bactria, King Demetrius used the kingdom's growing strength to launch an invasion of South Asia, likely taking advantage of the instability that followed the decline of the Mauryan Empire after the death of Ashoka. Demetrius crossed the Hindu Kush and conquered parts of present-day Pakistan around 180 BCE, establishing what became known as the Indo-Greek Kingdom in the Punjab region. Coins minted under Demetrius and his successors display bilingual inscriptions in Greek and Prakrit alongside Indian symbols, visual evidence of a genuine fusion between Greek and Indian cultures, as these so-called Yavana kings ruled over a population that included both Greek settlers and local Indian communities. One of the most celebrated Indo-Greek rulers, King Menander, became legendary for his wisdom and, according to later Buddhist tradition, for his personal embrace of Buddhist teachings. A famous Buddhist text known as the Milindapanha, or the Questions of King Milinda. Menander engaged in deep philosophical dialogue with the Buddhist monk Nagasena, and tradition holds that the Greek king eventually adopted the Buddhist path, even attaining a high spiritual rank by the end of his life. While this account is best understood as a literary and religious tradition rather than strict history, both Greek and Indian sources remember Menander as an example of just and thoughtful rulership. The Greek biographer Plutarch even records that after Menander's death, several of the towns under his rule for the honor of keeping a portion of his remains. Under Indo-Greek rule, the Gandhara region became a vibrant crossroads where Hellenistic artistic styles blended with Indian religious themes, laying the groundwork for the later flowering of Greco-Buddhist art. During this same period in western Iran, the Arsacid or Parthian Empire was steadily rising to rival the other great powers of the ancient world. After the death of Arsaces, his successors gradually extended Parthian control across the Iranian plateau. A particularly important figure, Mithridates I, transformed Parthia from a relatively modest regional kingdom into a major imperial power. Taking advantage of ongoing Seleucid weakness, Mithridates seized the region of Media around 148 BCE and soon afterward conquered Babylonia as well, entering the great city of Seleucia on the Tigris in 141 BCE amid a formal ceremony marking his new authority. Parthian forces went on to overrun the region of Elam and reached the shores of the Persian Gulf, while in the east, Mithridates annexed portions of Bactrian territory. By the 130s BCE, the Arsacid realm stretched all the way from the borders of Syria to the Oxus River. On his coinage, Mithridates was proudly titled the Great King, Arses, Philhellene, meaning a friend of Greek culture, and royal coins from his reign depict the Greek hero Heracles, likely identified in the Iranian tradition with the ancient hero Varathragna. At the same time, the Parthians firmly grounded their rule in native Iranian tradition, adopting the title Shahanshah or King of Kings, and maintaining fire temples, along with Zoroastrian religious practices, particularly as their hold on power grew more secure. The Parthians established several important royal centers, including the old city of Hakampylos, Ctesiphon on the Tigris, which grew into a grand capital city and would later host royal coronations, as well as Nisa in Parthia proper, where archaeologists have excavated a royal necropolis and treasury. At Nisa, excavators have uncovered elaborate wine-drinking vessels, carved ivory items, and administrative documents written in Aramaic. By around 130 BCE, the once mighty Seleucid Empire had been reduced to little more than a rump state, and two major new spheres of influence, the Hellenistic Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the east and the Parthian Empire in the west, now dominated the wider Iranian world. But it was at precisely this moment that a great migration from the Central Asians swept in to upend the Hellenistic order in the region. A confederation of Indo-European nomadic peoples, known in Chinese sources as the Yuezhi, and referred to by the Greeks as Tocharians, migrated southward and invaded Bactria, delivering a decisive blow to the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Chinese historical records indicate that the Yuezhi had originally been driven from their homeland in the Gansu region by another nomadic group known as the Xiongnu, setting off a chain reaction of migrations across Central Asia. These horse-mounted archer tribes swept through northern Bactria, overran its cities, and brought an end to more than a century of Greek rule in the region. In the aftermath of this invasion, the easternmost remnants of Alexander's legacy began to splinter further. Greek rule persisted for a time in the Kabul Valley and in parts of the Punjab, where Indo-Greek kings such as Heliocles and Strato II managed to hold on for a while longer, though they grew increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Internal rivalries and civil conflicts had already weakened the Indo-Greek states considerably. Now Scythian nomadic groups moved to take advantage of the situation as well. These were Saka peoples, originating from the broader Scythian world to the north, who pushed into parts of Bactria and the Indus Valley. By around 100 BCE, Indo-Scythian leaders such as Meos had firmly established themselves in former Indo-Greek territories, and the last remaining pockets of Greek rule in India were gradually absorbed or conquered over the following decades. Classical writers lamented what they described as the disappearance of Bactria, once called the ornament of the Iranian world, now overrun by nomadic invaders, and archaeological excavations at sites such as Ai-Khanum reveal evidence of sudden destruction and abandonment dating to this period. Yet the fall of Greco-Bactrian rule also opened the way for new, hybrid cultures to emerge. The Indo-Scythian ruler Azes stands out as a particularly significant figure, closely associated with the broader political consolidation of the northwestern region during this era. The Yuezhi people, who had settled in the Oxus region, would in time form the later Kushan Empire, while the Saka peoples who moved into the region later called Sakastan, as well as into the Punjab, gradually integrated their Indo-Scythian kingdoms into the wider fabric of Iranian and Indian society. The Parthian Empire, for its part, had to contend with these same nomadic pressures along its eastern frontier while simultaneously working to consolidate its recent gains in the west. The Seleucids made one final major effort to reverse Parthian expansion when Antiochus V. Sidetes launched a deep campaign into Parthian territory, only to be defeated and killed, an event that effectively ended all remaining Seleucid ambitions in the east. With this threat removed, the Parthians were able to turn their full attention to the ongoing nomadic incursions. During the reign of Mithridates Asu, Parthian forces engaged Saka tribes pressing into eastern Iran. Mithridates, who earned the titles King of Kings and the Great, decisively defeated the Saka in the province of Drangiana, reasserting Parthian control over the region, which came to be known afterward as the Land of the Saka, or Sakastan. After subduing or driving out many of these nomadic groups, Parthian kings began employing some of them as cavalry within their own armies, a pragmatic approach to turning former enemies into useful allies. Through these campaigns, Mithridates extended Parthority all the way to the borders of Bactria and the Indo-Iranian frontier by around 100 BCE. It was also during Mithridates' reign that formal diplomatic contact with Han China first began. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Chinese envoy Zhang Qian reached the region of Fergana and learned of Parthia, which the Chinese referred to as Anxi, describing it as a wealthy and powerful empire lying on the far western horizon of the known world. Soon afterward, Silk Road trade routes opened in earnest. Chinese silk began reaching Parthian territory, and Parthia positioned itself as a crucial middleman in the growing exchange of goods between China and the Mediterranean world, a role that would only deepen as east-west contact continued to grow over the following centuries. Even so, Parthia's most pressing concern remained its western frontier, where a formidable new rival was beginning to stir. In the late 1st century BCE, Rome expanded its influence into the Near East, and conflict with Parthia became increasingly difficult to avoid. In 53 BCE, the Roman statesman and general Crassus led a large army into Mesopotamia, seeking military glory and wealth at Parthia's expense. But the campaign ended in disaster for Rome. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthian commander known as Murena inflicted a crushing defeat on Crassus's legion, using waves of mounted archers and heavily armored cavalry to devastating effect, including the famous tactic later called the Parthian shot, in which horsemen fired arrows backward while pretending to retreat. Crassus was killed, and his army's prized military standards were captured, a humiliating loss that echoed powerfully back in Rome. Parthia's victory at Carrhae cemented its reputation as the one Eastern power genuinely capable of standing up to Roman military might, and marked the beginning of a long and often bitter Roman-Parthian rivalry. By around 50 BCE, after also capturing the strategically important buffer state of Armenia, the Arsacid-Parthian Empire presided over a vast realm from the Euphrates all the way to the Hindu Kush, governing a patchwork of provinces and semi-independent vassal kingdoms through a comparatively loose, federated system of rule. The empire's military strength rested heavily on its cavalry, both swift horse archers and heavily armored cataphracts, as well as on the strategic use of semi-autonomous local rulers who paid formal homage to the Parthian court at Ctesiphon. To really understand the remarkable resilience of the Parthian state, it helps to look beyond the king of kings himself to the unique political structure built around what became known as the 7 great noble houses of Iran. Unlike the highly centralized Roman Empire, or even the earlier Achaemenid state, Parthia functioned more like a feudal confederation of powerful noble families. Foremost among these were the House of Shurin and the House of Karen. The Shurin family, based in the region of Sistan, held the hereditary honor of placing the crown on a new king's head during coronation ceremonies and commanded substantial private armies of their own. It was, notably, the general Murena from this very family who defeated Crassus, rather than the Parthian king himself. This decentralized structure was very much a double-edged sword for the empire. On one hand, it made Parthia extraordinarily difficult to conquer outright. Even if Rome managed to capture an important city, the great noble houses could simply retreat to their own strongholds and mount a counterattack later. On the other hand, these same powerful nobles frequently acted as kingmakers, removing monarchs who displeased them, which contributed to the recurring dynastic conflicts that plagued the empire in its later years. Despite these internal tensions, Parthian society remained notably culturally diverse and pluralistic. Greek continued to serve as an administrative and court language for centuries after Alexander, while the Parthian language, likely related to the older Median tongue, remained dominant among the ruling elite. A well-known anecdote describes Parthian nobles reclining on golden couches at royal banquets while their horses stood ready nearby, a vivid illustration of the blend of nomadic steppe heritage and settled Persian luxury that characterized the Parthian court. In the final decades of the Roman Republic, Rome and Parthia continued to compete for influence over the strategically vital buffer state of Armenia. In 40 BCE, taking advantage of Rome's own internal civil wars, the Parthian prince Pacorus led an invasion into Roman-held territory. Parthian forces overran Syria and even advanced into Judea, installing local client rulers who were openly hostile to Rome. This incursion was eventually checked by Ventidius, a lieutenant serving under Mark Antony, who defeated and killed Pacorus in 38 BCE. Mark Antony himself then led a large-scale invasion of Parthia in 36 BCE, but the campaign ended in failure, and an uneasy stalemate settled in between the two powers. It was only under Augustus Caesar that a lasting diplomatic resolution was finally reached. In 20 BCE, the Parthian king Crassus IV returned the military standards captured from Crassus decades earlier back to Augustus, a powerful public relations victory for Rome and an important symbol of peace between the two empires. As part of this broader settlement, Augustus received several of Crassus's own sons as hostages to help guarantee good behavior, while in turn sending an Italian woman named Musa to the Parthian court, where she would later become queen. Roman writers of the period, though frequently hostile in tone toward Parthia, nonetheless generally acknowledged it as Rome's genuine equal in the Eastern world. A key long-term settlement over Armenia came only after the Roman-Parthian War of the years 58 to 63 CE. The resulting compromise, often referred to as the Peace of Rhandaea, allowed for an Arsacid prince to serve as king of Armenia, but required that he formally receive his crown directly from the Roman emperor. The coronation of the Armenian king Tiridates in Rome by the Emperor Nero symbolized this delicate balance of power, one that held somewhat uneasily for several decades and set the pattern for future disputes between Rome and Iran over control of Armenia. Meanwhile, in the lands further to the east, Parthian central authority remained considerably weaker. Eastern Iran and the regions bordering the Indus were largely governed by local rulers, who often acted with a great deal of independence. One notable example was Gondophares, a Parthian nobleman who declared independence around 19 CE and founded what became known as the Indo-Parthian Kingdom. Centered in the regions of Arachosia and Gandhara, Gondophares adopted the title King of Kings and ruled over territory that had previously fallen under both Parthian and Indo-Scythian control. Coins issued under Gondophares depict the king on horseback being crowned by the Greek goddess of victory, with inscriptions in both Greek and local Kharosthi script. Gondophares also holds a notable place in later Christian tradition. The apocryphal Acts of Thomas describes a King Gudnafar in India who receives the Apostle Thomas, and most scholars identify this figure with the historical Gondophares, suggesting that the Indo-Parthian kingdom may have had some of the earliest contacts between the region and nascent Christianity. Although Gondophares' dynasty did not endure for very long, fragmenting after his death around 46 CE, it nonetheless helped set the stage for the rise of another major power originating from the north, the Kushans. Far to the northeast, the Ueshi tribes that had earlier overrun Bactria were gradually coming together into a unified political force. In the middle of the 1st century CE, a capable and ambitious leader named Kujula Cadphises united the 5 Ueshi clans into a single kingdom. He adopted the title of Kushan king and established authority over Bactria and the Kabul River basin, founding what would become the Kushan Empire. The Kushans quickly absorbed the remaining fragments of the earlier Indo-Greek and Indo-Scythian states. Vima Cadphises, Kujula's grandson, further consolidated these territorial gains and issued abundant gold coinage as a sign of the kingdom's growing wealth and stability. By the end of the 1st century CE, Kushan territory encompassed nearly all of present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, along with parts of northern India, forming a genuine Indo-Iranian empire that rivaled the Parthians in scale and influence. On its northern frontier, the Kushan Empire also owned control over the important caravan cities of Sogdiana and the trade routes leading toward China, placing the Kushans at a crucial crossroads of trade across the ancient world, a position they worked hard to maintain and protect. By the early 2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire reached the height of its power under the Emperor Kanishka the Great. Kanishka's territory stretched from the Oxus Valley across the Hindu Kush, over the Gangetic Plain, and northward into the Tarim Basin. He and his predecessors maintained twin capital cities, one used during the summer months and another during the winter. A remarkable archaeological discovery known as the Bigram Hoard found at a Kushan summer palace site in Afghanistan, contained an extraordinary collection of objects gathered from across the ancient world, including delicate Roman glassware, finely lacquered Chinese boxes, and intricately carved Indian ivory panels. Together, these treasures suggest that merchants traveling from places as distant as Alexandria and Xi'an converged at the Kushan royal court, bringing luxury goods that the Kushan elite eagerly collected and displayed. At the same time, goods produced within Kushan territory, such as finely crafted Bactrian goldwork and woven textiles, traveled outward along established trade routes to both the east and the west. Indian spices, Afghan lapis lazuli, and Chinese silk all moved along the Silk Road with Kushan caravans, and the Kukushans benefited enormously from the resulting commerce. Although originally steppe nomads, the Kushans rapidly adopted many features of settled civilization. They used a modified form of the Greek alphabet to write the Bactrian language on their coins and official inscriptions. The famous Rabatak inscription of Kanishka, for example, is written in the Eastern Iranian Bactrian language but rendered in Greek script, and it proudly records the king's lineage and military conquests in India, effectively bridging three distinct cultural worlds within a single text. Kushan coinage from this period displays an unusually broad and eclectic pantheon, featuring Greek deities alongside Indian and Iranian gods. Kanishka is particularly well known for issuing coins depicting the Buddha, labeled simply Bado in Greek script, representing the earliest known depiction of the Buddha on coinage, and showing him with a halo styled somewhat like a Hellenistic demigod. This reflects the important role that Kushan royal patronage played in the development and spread of Mahayana Buddhism. Buddhist tradition credits Kanishka with convening a major Buddhist council in Kashmir, where scholars are said to have worked to codify Buddhist scriptures, an event sometimes referred to as the Fourth Buddhist Council. Under Kushan rule, Buddhism spread widely from India into Central Asia and along the Silk Road, and many later Central Asian and Chinese Buddhist pilgrims came to regard Kanishka's reign as something of a golden age for the Buddhist faith. The distinctive art of the Gandhara region flourished during this period as well, as local artisans, influenced by earlier Greek naturalistic traditions, began creating the first anthropomorphic images of the Buddha in human form. These Gandharan statues often did the Buddha as a robed figure with an almost Apollo-like classical appearance, as seen in standing statues discovered such as Takat Ibahi. Wavy hair reminiscent of Greek sculpture, even though the hand gestures and broader iconography remain distinctly Buddhist in character. The Kushan Empire generally maintained cordial relations with the Parthian state to its west. Traveling Buddhist monks, including the Chinese monk Lokaksema, translated Buddhist scriptures into Chinese and carried them back to the city of Luoyang, marking an important early stage in the broader absorption of Buddhism into Chinese religious life. By around 200 CE, the political unity of the Kushan Empire began to loosen considerably. Regional governors in Bactria, in the far western territories, and in the south began acting with growing independence, while new challenges emerged both within Iran and among local Indian powers, gradually threatening the empire's cohesion. Even so, the broader Kushan legacy endured through the lasting Buddhist institutions established across Central Asia and through the enduring artistic heritage of Gandhara. Even nomadic elites farther to the north were drawn into this rich and interconnected cultural world. At the site of Tilia Tepe in northern Afghanistan, a set of 6th-century burials, likely belonging to a local noble family, yielded more than 20,000 gold objects, including elaborate crowns like trees, decorative plaques featuring steppe animal motifs, and necklace set with gemstones imported from distant regions. Alongside this local jewelry, archaeologists also found coins minted by Parthian kings, a Roman coin bearing the image of the Emperor Tiberius, and various local currency, vivid physical evidence of just how far-reaching trade and cultural exchange had become. While the Kushan Empire enjoyed this period of relative prosperity, the Parthian Empire itself was, by the 2nd century CE, gradually approaching its final decline. Despite clear signs of internal weakening, Parthia remained capable of impressive military achievements, including further significant clashes with Rome. A series of capable Arsacid kings, including Osroes I, Vologases III in Ivo, and Artabanus IV, also known as Ardavan, worked hard to maintain Parthian strength even as they faced growing internal pressures alongside repeated wars with Rome. Between 114 and 117 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan invaded Mesopotamia, determined to succeed where Crassus had failed generations earlier. Trajan managed to capture the Parthian capital at Sisyphon in 116 CCE and even formally declared Mesopotamia a new Roman province, marking the high watermark of a military advance into Parthian territory. Commemorative coins were struck showing Trajan bearing the title Parthicus, celebrating his victory over Parthia. This triumph, however, proved short-lived. Rebellions broke out behind Roman lines, forcing Trajan to retreat, and after his death, his successor Hadrian chose to relinquish the newly conquered Parthian territory entirely, preferring instead a more stable and defensible frontier along the Euphrates River. Parthian resilience against Rome was demonstrated once again during the Roman-Parthian War of 161 to 166 CE, when Vologases IV invaded both Armenia and Syria, prompting the Roman co-emperor Lucius Verus to launch a major counterattack. Roman legions once again captured and sacked Ctesiphon, but a devastating outbreak of what became known as the Antonine Plague soon ravaged the Roman army, ultimately forcing a full withdrawal. Later, during the Severan period, Parthia suffered another significant blow when the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus captured and thoroughly plundered Ctesiphon in 197 CE, deporting large numbers of its residents before eventually withdrawing due to a shortage of supplies. Ctesiphon was subsequently rebuilt and returned to Parthian control. Each time, the Parthian monarchy managed to recover from these setbacks, though generally emerging somewhat weaker and more politically fragmented than before. Roman historians frequently express mixture of admiration and scorn at Parthia's remarkable ability to rebound from repeated military defeats relatively unscathed, often attributing this resilience to the underlying network of powerful feudal lords who'd reconstitute royal authority, even after a king had been decisively defeated in battle. But with the gradual reduction of major external threats, the very structural feature that had once made Parthia so resilient, its reliance on powerful semi-independent feudal lords, increasingly became a serious internal weakness instead. Queen Musa, the former Italian slave who had been given to King Frats IV, reportedly conspired to poison her own husband and briefly ruled alongside her son around the turn of the 1st century CE, before the two of them were eventually deposed in turn. Regional governors across the empire increasingly behaved like independent princes in their own right. Border territories such as Armenia, Adiabene, and Kerosene became semi-independent buffers. States skillfully played Rome and Parthia against one another for their own advantage. Economically, Parthia had grown quite wealthy through extensive trade, though a significant share of that wealth remained concentrated in the hands of these increasingly autonomous local rulers rather than the central Parthian court. Even in its later, more troubled years, Parthia remained a genuinely significant world power and an important channel for cultural exchange. Hellenistic influence persistedly in Parthian art, with surviving statues and temple reliefs, this blend of Greek and Mesopotamian artistic styles, though with a distinctive Parthian twist of their own. Figures in this period are often depicted facing directly forward, staring outward toward the viewer, a stylistic convention closely associated with Parthian-era art. In matters of religion, the Parthians generally tolerated a wide range of traditions, including Greek religious cults, Babylonian astrology, Judaism, early Christianity, and the continued worship of native Iranian deities. Later Persian literary and oral traditions, including the great national epic known as the Shahnameh, preserve only fragmentary and often distorted memories of both the Seleucid and Parthian periods, frequently compressing centuries of complex history into a brief and somewhat shadowy list of kings. Because so much of this history was originally recorded by Greek and Latin writers, rather than preserved directly within Persian chronicles themselves. And yet, on the ground, and scientific learning had taken genuine root in places like Ai-Khanum, even as Iranian and Indian spiritual ideas simultaneously flowed westward in the opposite direction. The cult of Mithras, which later became quite popular within the Roman Empire, likely developed out of earlier Iranian religious traditions associated with Parthian-era worship, while Buddhism, carried westward and eastward by Kushan-era monks, would eventually spread as far as China and beyond. But the final collapse of the Arsacid Parthian Empire came relatively swiftly in the early 3rd century CE. In the region of Persis, a vassal kingdom that had long remained under Parthian overlordship, a local Persian prince named Ardashir, son of Papak, rose in open rebellion, claiming descent from the legendary Achaemenid kings of old. Ardashir had spent years steadily consolidating his own regional power base, and by systematically defeating a series of neighboring local rulers, he eventually gained enough military strength to directly challenge his own Parthian overlord, King Artabanus IV. The two rival forces met at the decisive Battle of Hormozgan in 224 CE, where Ardashir won a clear and decisive victory. King Artabanus IV himself was killed during the fighting. With this defeat, the roughly 500-year-old Arsacid dynasty finally came to an end. Ardashir entered Ctesiphon in triumph and was crowned Shahanshah, King of Kings of Iran, formally founding the Sasanian Empire, named in honor of his ancestor Sasan, an event that heralded the beginning of a genuine renaissance in Persian imperial power. Later Iranian tradition, preserved in Middle Persian texts and later reflected in Ferdowsi's great epic the Shahnameh, tends to portray the Parthians somewhat unfavorably as a comparatively weak and culturally foreign dynasty, while presenting Ardashir as the rightful restorer of authentic Persian kingship. In this later narrative tradition, the Parthians are often described as having grown weak and insufficiently Iranian in their customs, opening the way for a genuine revival of traditional Persian rule under Ardashir. In historical reality, however, Ardashir's ultimate victory owed less to any straightforward nationalist sentiment and can considerably more to the underlying structural weaknesses that had long affected Parthian rule, combined with crucial support from numerous disaffected Parthian nobles who saw an opportunity for change. By 226 CE, Ardashir had eliminated the last remaining Arsacid claimants to the throne, firmly and permanently establishing the Sasanian dynasty in their place, and marking the dawn of a reborn Persian Empire.